One of the most notorious and barbaric kings of England was King Henry VIII, who on the 28th of February 1547 died inside of his bedchambers inside the Palace of Whitehall. Henry VIII's death was one which was stark contrasted to the crazy and chaotic life that the Tudor king lived. He was a man who had executed two of his own wives, with Anne Boleyn and Catherine Howard being condemned within the walls of the Tower of London. But the king in his final years had grown to a huge size, and it was a long departure from the handsome prince and the sporty prince that he once was. Following a jousting accident that almost killed him, Henry's mental health also took a huge deterioration, and he would even turn on some of his closest friends, sending Cromwell, for example, to the execution scaffold on Tower Hill. However, Henry's death was peaceful and quiet, but in the years following, a rather terrifying story emerged with regards to the body of King Henry VIII when it was taken on procession to its final resting place. It was claimed that the body of the Tudor king exploded inside of an abbey where it had been laid to rest. Join us today as we look at the exploding body of King Henry VIII, and as always, to support our channel, please make sure to subscribe. On the 28th of January 1547, King Henry VIII died inside of his bedchambers inside the Palace of Whitehall. He was accompanied by the Archbishop of Canterbury, Thomas Cranmer, and Henry VIII on his deathbed realised that he had committed a huge amount of sin and terror during his time on the throne. He admitted that the sins he had committed were great and was probably on his mind when he was lying on his deathbed, and specifically this may have been the execution of his second wife, Anne Boleyn, who was most certainly a victim of her husband. But in the moments after the king's death, his body was left inside of his bedchamber, and then the body was washed. It was also embalmed, with the king's vital organs being removed, and the reason for this was to try and preserve the body as long as possible. This was common during the Tudor period and the medieval period. Oliver Cromwell's body, the following century, was buried in secret very quickly because of the speed in which decay of his corpse occurred. But the embalming of King Henry VIII was normal, and his chest was cut open and his vital organs and heart were removed. They were then placed inside of lead caskets to be buried elsewhere. The king's chest cavity was then stuffed with spices and sawdust to try and prevent rot setting in and to prevent nasty smells. But then Henry VIII's body was placed inside of a lead casket before it was then placed inside an outer shell wooden coffin. The lead-lined coffin, it was believed, would preserve the king's body from decomposition, and there were a number of medieval kings whose bodies today, it's believed, are still very well preserved, and they had been buried many centuries ago. Henry VIII may have also had his body wrapped in a thick, heavy cloth, which was dipped in a wax to keep away decay, and this was known as a cerecloth. One of Henry VIII's final wishes was that he wanted to be buried with his final wife, Jane Seymour, inside a specially built vault in St George's Chapel within the walls of Windsor Castle. Jane had passed away following giving birth to Henry VIII's heir, Edward VI, and many said that Jane was Henry's most loved wife of the six that he had. But the king wanted to be briefly interred in this vault, as he planned to be buried later inside of a huge tomb which would presumably be placed inside of Westminster Abbey. But this tomb would never be finished, and because of this, over 500 years on, Henry VIII is buried inside of this vault against his true wishes. There is little that marks the burial place of the most infamous king ever to rule over England, except a small marble slab telling the tourists who visit St George's Chapel today who is literally buried beneath their feet. But there was one crazy and shocking story that emerged regarding Henry VIII's body exploding when it was on its way to be buried inside of Windsor. The procession of the king's remains to the chapel was huge and colossal, and it was over 4 miles long, and the roads of the route had to even be widened to allow the coffin and also the pageantry to pass by. For many people who witnessed the procession, it was the first time they'd ever seen any image of the man who had ruled over them, as his effigy passed by them, which had been placed on top of the coffin. The hearse which this was on was pulled by horses, which had been draped in black cloth, and the funeral procession, because of the length and scale of it, needed to rest overnight. To make sure that the animals and the guards were well rested for the arrival of the king's body at the final resting place, Syon Abbey was chosen as a resting place for the night. It was planned for the next morning for the coffin to continue on to Windsor, but it was here where it has been alleged that the king's body exploded whilst it was resting. The rumour states that the king's body exploded inside of the coffin and that then liquid dripped out from the bottom of this. 12 years before Henry VIII died, in 1535, a friar named William Peyton preached before the king at Greenwich Palace that God's judgments were ready to fall upon his head, and that dogs would lick his blood as they had done to Ahab, and Ahab did more to provoke the Lord God than all the kings that were before him. With this man made a prophecy that the king's remains would be eaten and licked at by dogs. But did this actually happen? It is common for gases from the body to be expelled after death, and with the movement of the funeral procession, this was certainly a possibility, as the body of Henry VIII would have been moved and jolted en route inside the coffin. Henry's daughter, Elizabeth I, would, following her own death, explode whilst inside of the coffin, and it was said her coffin even splintered due to the strength of the explosion. But modern-day morticians even claim that gases build up during decomposition, that these can blow open the lid of a modern sealed coffin, showing how strong they actually can be. Regarding the explosion of Henry VIII's body, one writer during the Victorian period wrote, "The king being carried to Windsor to be buried stood all night amongst the broken walls of Syon, and there the leaden coffin being cleft by the shaking of the carriage, the pavement of the church was wetted with Henry's blood. In the morning came plumbers to solder the coffin, whose under feet I tremble whilst I write it, was suddenly seen a dog creeping and licking up the king's blood. If you ask me how I know this, I answer, William Greville, who could scarcely drive away the dog, who told me, and so did the plumber also." But it's believed that the source for this disturbing event is a man named Gilbert Burnet, who during the 17th century wrote, and he became the Bishop of Salisbury, but over time this morose story has been accepted as fact. There was no record of Henry VIII being transferred to a different coffin after any explosion took place. There was also no other spare coffin used for Henry. But following its night at Syon Abbey, the procession continued to St George's Chapel, and it was carried into the church by 16 strong yeomen of the guard. The funeral service then took place, and as mentioned, still today, Henry VIII is buried inside the vault where he was interred. But there has been great damage caused to Henry VIII's coffin, and this was documented in the centuries after, as his burial vault has been broken into a number of times. This damage may even have been caused when the coffin of King Charles I was placed next to the great coffin of the Tudor monarch, as it was referred to, and the outer wooden shell was so badly splintered that it was said that Henry VIII's face could be viewed inside the coffin, and it was open to the elements, meaning decay had set in. But whether the body of Henry VIII did explode or not is debatable, but the damage to the coffin did come from somewhere. But to many people, it was a brutal end for a man who was such a horrific tyrant during his time on the throne during the Tudor period. Thanks for watching. To support our channel, please click subscribe down below, and once again, thank you so much for watching.